The silence in the auction hall wasn't empty, it was full of judgment. Margaret Hale stood on that platform, 53 years old, holding a Christmas basket worth more than the town would ever admit, and not one man would meet her eyes. They were waiting for her to break, waiting for her land, waiting for her to disappear like women her age were supposed to. But when those doors slammed open and Caleb North walked in with $5 and a look that could cut stone, everything changed. This is the story of a woman who refused to vanish. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The December cold had teeth that year. It came down from the mountains surrounding Redwood Hollow like something alive, something hungry, settling into the bones of the town with the kind of permanence that made people wonder if spring would ever come again. The kind of cold that made wood crack in the night and turned breath into ghosts and reminded everyone that survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned, day by bitter day. Margaret Hale knew that better than most. She stood in the back room of the town hall, listening to the muffled voices beyond the door, her hands wrapped around a basket that had taken her 3 days to prepare. Inside were preserves she'd put up in August when the fruit was still sweet before Thomas died. Before the world contracted to the size of her small homestead and the impossible mathematics of winter. How many cords of wood, how many pounds of flour, how many days until the money ran out completely. The basket was lined with a cloth she'd embroidered 15 years ago, back when her hands were steadier and the future seemed like something she could plan for. The jars were arranged carefully, raspberry preserves, pickled vegetables, a small container of honey she'd traded for with the last of her eggs. There was a loaf of bread she'd baked that morning, still faintly warm, and a sachet of dried herbs from her garden. It was modest, honest, the kind of gift that showed effort, care, the work of hands that knew how to make something from almost nothing. It was also everything she had left to give. Mrs. Hale? The voice belonged to Dorothy Chen, one of the younger women helping coordinate the Christmas basket auction. She was kind, in the careful way people were kind to those they pitied. "We're about ready for you," Margaret nodded, lifting the basket. Her back ached. It always did now. A deep, persistent reminder of 27 years working a farm alongside Thomas, and then 3 years working it alone after the fever took him. Her hands were rougher than they used to be, the knuckles swollen in the cold. Her dark hair, pulled back in a simple knot, was more gray than brown now. She was 53 years old, and the town had already decided she was finished. Dorothy held the door open, and Margaret stepped through into the main hall. The room was packed. The Christmas basket auction was the social event of the season in Redwood Hollow, a tradition that went back decades. Single women prepared elaborate baskets, and the men bid on them. The winning bidder earned the right to share the meal with the woman who'd prepared it. It was courtship dressed up as charity, a way for young people to navigate the complicated dance of attraction under the watchful eyes of the entire community. Except Margaret wasn't young, and she wasn't courting. She was trying to survive. The format had changed over the years. Widows could participate now, though everyone understood what it meant when they did. It meant desperation. It meant the farm was failing, the debts were mounting, the walls were closing in. It meant standing in front of the whole town and admitting you couldn't make it alone. Margaret walked to the platform at the front of the room, her spine straight despite everything. She could feel the weight of their stares, the quick, sidelong glances, the whispered conversations behind raised hands. Poor Margaret Hale. 3 years since Thomas passed. That farm's too much for a woman alone. She should sell, move to town, find some kind of work she can manage. At her age? Doing what? The auctioneer was Bernard Shaw, a florid man in his 60s who owned the largest mercantile in town. He smiled at Margaret with the kind of professional sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next basket comes from Mrs. Margaret Hale, widow of the late Thomas Hale, who many of you knew as a fine craftsman and good neighbor." Margaret set the basket on the display table. Under the lamplight, it looked smaller than it had in her kitchen. More humble. The ribbon she'd tied around the handle seemed suddenly childish, a foolish attempt at decoration that only highlighted how little she had to offer. "Mrs. Hale has prepared what I'm sure is a lovely selection of preserves and baked goods," Bernard continued, his tone suggesting he hadn't bothered to actually look. "Shall we start the bidding at $1? Silence. Margaret kept her eyes forward, focused on a point just above the crowd. She'd known this would be hard. She'd prepared herself for it, or thought she had. But standing there in the actual moment, feeling the weight of that silence, was different than imagining it. $1, Bernard repeated, his smile tightening slightly. Surely we can start at $1 for such a fine basket. More silence. Someone coughed. A baby fussed in the back of the room until its mother shushed it quiet. Margaret's hands were clasped in front of her, fingers intertwined to keep them from shaking. The humiliation was a physical thing, hot and heavy in her chest. But she wouldn't look down, wouldn't give them that. 50 cents then, Bernard said, and now there was a note of irritation creeping into his voice. Come now, gentlemen, it's Christmas. I'll give you 25 cents. The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, followed by a ripple of laughter. Margaret couldn't see who'd spoken, but she recognized the tone. Young, cruel in the careless way of someone who didn't understand what cruelty cost. 25 cents is not a serious bid, Bernard said sharply. This is a charity event, not a... Charity's right, someone else muttered, just loud enough to carry. That's what she needs. Margaret's jaw tightened. She could feel it starting to crack, the careful composure she'd built up over 3 years of grief and loneliness and impossible work. She'd buried her husband. She'd learned to plow fields and mend fences and slaughter chickens. She'd survived a winter alone in that farmhouse with nothing but her own determination to keep her warm. But this, standing on display while the town debated her worth in nickels and dimes, this was different. Perhaps we should move on, Dorothy Chen said quietly from the side of the platform, her face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. No, Margaret said, her voice steady despite everything. Bernard's running an auction. Let him run it. Bernard looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. Very well. Do I hear 50 cents? The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Margaret could see them now, really see them. The faces she'd known for decades. Robert Mills, who'd bought furniture from Thomas. Sarah and John Pritchard, whose daughter Margaret had helped nurse through scarlet fever 10 years ago. David Chen, Dorothy's husband, who'd borrowed Thomas's tools more times than anyone could count and never returned half of them. They were looking everywhere but at her. 50 cents? Bernard's voice had lost its professional warmth. Now he just sounded tired. Anyone? Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking, hardening, crystallizing into something cold and clear and sharp. She'd been foolish to come here. Foolish to think that what she'd built over 27 years of marriage and partnership meant anything once she was alone. The town didn't see Margaret Hale, farm wife and survivor. They saw a widow past her prime, an inconvenience, a problem to be managed until nature or poverty solved it for them. I'll take it home, she said quietly. Thank you, Bernard. Now, Margaret, it's fine. She reached for the basket, her movements careful and deliberate. I understand. Wait. The voice came from the back of the hall, deep and rough like gravel scraped over stone. The crowd turned, a collective movement of surprise, and Margaret looked up despite herself. The doors had opened without anyone noticing, letting in a gust of winter air that made the lamps flicker. Framed in the doorway was a man Margaret had seen perhaps 3 times in as many years, and never closer than across a street. Caleb North. He was tall, taller than anyone else in the room, with shoulders built from years of physical labor in the mountains. His hair was dark, shot through with gray, worn long enough to brush his collar. His face was weathered, carved into hard lines by wind and sun and solitude. He wore a heavy coat, faded but well-made, and boots that had seen serious miles. But it was his eyes that held the room, pale gray, cold as winter sky, and utterly uncompromising. The crowd parted as he walked through, not out of courtesy, but instinct. Caleb North was a man people gave space to. He lived alone in the high country, running trap lines and trading furs, and appearing in town only when absolutely necessary. There were stories about him, stories about a past no one quite knew, about skills with weapons that suggested a history beyond fur trapping, about a temperament that made wise men cautious. Margaret watched him approach the platform, her heart doing something strange in her chest. Fear, maybe, or something else she couldn't quite name. Caleb stopped directly in front of Bernard Shaw. Up close, he was even more imposing, not just his size, but the absolute stillness he carried, like a predator deciding whether or not to move. "What's the bid?" he asked. Bernard blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The basket." Caleb's gaze shifted to Margaret, held for a moment that seemed to stretch out longer than it should, then moved back to Bernard. "What's the current bid?" There isn't one. We were just about to, $5. The room went silent in a different way now, not the silence of judgment, but shock. $5 was extravagant. $5 was what the prettiest girls in town commanded, the ones with elaborate baskets full of fried chicken and layer cakes and all manner of delicacies. $5 was a statement. "Mr. North, that's very generous, but $5, Caleb repeated, pulling a small leather pouch from his coat. He counted out 5 gold coins, each one catching the lamplight as he placed them on the table in front of Bernard with deliberate precision. They rang against the wood like a bell, clear and final. "Going once," Bernard said faintly, his professional instincts taking over even though his face still registered disbelief. "Going twice." He waited, but no one else in that room was going to bid against Caleb North. "Sold to Mr. North for $5. Caleb picked up the basket with the kind of care that suggested he understood how much it had cost Margaret to make it. Then he turned to her, extending his other hand. "Ma'am." Margaret stared at that outstretched hand. It was scarred, weathered, the hand of a man who'd worked hard and fought harder. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why this near stranger had just spent $5 on a basket worth maybe 75 cents, why he was looking at her with those cold gray eyes that somehow didn't feel cold at all in that moment. But she understood one thing: he was offering her a way off this platform. She took his hand. His grip was warm, steady, surprisingly gentle for someone who looked like he could break stone with his bare hands. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." He led her through the crowd, still holding her hand, the basket tucked under his other arm. People scattered out of their way. Margaret caught glimpses of faces as they passed: shock, confusion, a few knowing smirks from the younger men who thought they understood what was happening. Let them think what they wanted. The cold air hit her like a slap when they stepped outside, but Margaret had never been so grateful for it. Her lungs expanded, pulling in the clean, sharp cold, washing away the stale heat and judgment of the hall. Caleb led her to a horse tied at the rail, a big buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that spoke of good training. Without asking, Caleb lifted her onto the saddle, his hands on her waist strong and sure, then swung up behind her. "Where are we going?" Margaret managed to ask. "Away from here." He urged the horse forward, and they left the town hall behind, left the staring faces and whispered conversations, left everything Margaret had known for most of her life. They rode in silence through the streets of Redwood Hollow. The town looked different from horseback, smaller somehow, the buildings hunched against the cold like animals in a storm. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin gray columns reaching for a sky heavy with the promise of more snow. Caleb guided the horse onto the mountain road that wound up into the high country. The path was narrow, bordered by pine trees laden with snow that glowed blue-white in the moonlight. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, the creak of leather, the whisper of wind through frozen branches. Margaret had 1,000 questions, but there was something about the silence, about the warmth of Caleb's body behind her blocking the wind, about the simple fact that someone had chosen her, had paid $5 for the privilege of her company, that made her content to wait. They rode for perhaps 20 minutes before Caleb slowed the horse and guided it off the main path onto a smaller trail that Margaret hadn't even noticed in the dark. Another 5 minutes brought them to a clearing where a cabin stood, solid and well-built, smoke rising from its chimney. Caleb dismounted first, then lifted Margaret down. "I'll tend to the horse. Go inside. It's warm." The cabin was indeed warm, heated by a fire and a stone hearth that looked like it had been burning for hours. The interior was spare but clean, a table and 2 chairs, a bed in the corner with blankets neatly folded, shelves lined with supplies and tools, animal pelts stretched on frames along one wall. It was the home of a man who lived deliberately, who kept only what he needed and maintained everything with care. Margaret stood near the fire, letting the heat soak into her bones, still trying to process what had happened. The auction felt like something from another lifetime now, the humiliation already starting to fade into unreality. The door opened and Caleb entered, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He set the basket on the table, then moved to the fire to add another log. "Thank you," Margaret said, "for what you did back there." Caleb didn't turn around. "Didn't do it for thanks." "Why did you do it?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough, with something that might have been old anger. "I was at the back of that hall for 20 minutes before I came in, listening to them decide what you were worth, watching them pretend you weren't there." He turned to face her then, and his eyes were harder than she'd seen them. "I've seen a lot of cruel things, Mrs. Hale. But that silence, that was cruelty dressed up as courtesy. And I don't have much patience for that kind of thing." Margaret felt something tighten in her throat. "You don't even know me." "I know you've been working that farm alone for 3 years. I know you've kept it running when most men couldn't manage it with help. I know you stood up there with your head high while they tried to break you, and you didn't give them the satisfaction." He paused. "That's enough to know." "You've been watching me?" Margaret wasn't sure if she should be disturbed or touched. "I'm in town maybe once a month. Hard not to notice when someone's doing the impossible." Caleb moved to the table, started unpacking the basket. "You put this together with the last of your winter stores, didn't you?" "How did you—" "Because I know what the last of winter stores looks like." He held up one of the jars of preserves, examined it in the firelight. "Raspberry. That's August fruit. You've been saving this." Margaret couldn't find words. This stranger, this man she'd barely seen, never spoken to until tonight, understood more about her situation in 5 minutes than people who'd known her for decades. Caleb set out the contents of the basket with surprising care, arranging them on the table like they mattered. The bread, the preserves, the pickled vegetables, the honey. Then he went to his own shelves and added to the spread a piece of cured venison, some hard cheese, a jug of what might have been cider. "Sit," he said, pulling out one of the chairs for her. Margaret sat, because her legs were suddenly shaky, and because she didn't know what else to do. Caleb took the other chair, cut slices of bread and venison with a knife that looked like it could field dress a bear. He pushed a plate toward her. "Eat." She should have been nervous, alone in a cabin with a strange man in the middle of the mountains at night. But she wasn't. There was something about Caleb North that felt safe. Not soft, not gentle, but safe in the way a strong wall was safe, a shelter against the storm. Margaret took a bite of bread. It tasted better here, in this rough cabin, than it had in her own kitchen. They ate in silence for a while. Comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, but inside the cabin was warm and solid. "The farm," Caleb said eventually. "How bad is it?" Margaret set down her bread. "Bad. Thomas had debts I didn't know about. The bank's been patient, but patience runs out. I've got until spring to make the payment, or they take the land." "How much?" $200. Caleb's expression didn't change. "That's a lot. More than I can make before spring. More than I can make in 2 springs, probably." Margaret heard the defeat in her own voice and hated it. "I've sold everything I can sell. The livestock, most of the tools. I've got seed saved for planting, but that won't help if I don't have land to plant it in." "There's no one who can help? No family?" "Thomas's brother died in the war. My parents passed years ago. No children." She paused. "And even if there were, I wouldn't ask. I've made it this far on my own. I'll figure something out." Caleb studied her across the table, those gray eyes seeing too much. "You came to that auction thinking someone might bid high enough to make a difference." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "I came to that auction because I was desperate and foolish enough to think maybe the town would remember what Thomas and I gave for 27 years, what we built, what we contributed." She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "I was wrong." "They didn't forget," Caleb said quietly. "They just decided it didn't matter once you were alone." The truth of that hit harder than Margaret expected. She blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes, refusing to let the tears fall. "I've been alone before," she said, her voice rough. I'll manage. You shouldn't have to. Something in the way he said it made Margaret look up. Caleb was watching her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. What do you want? She asked, because there had to be an angle, had to be something. Men didn't spend $5 for nothing. Want? Caleb leaned back in his chair. I want to live in these mountains in peace. I want people to leave me alone. I want the world to be less ugly than it is. He paused. And tonight, I wanted to make sure that what happened to you in that hall didn't end the way they wanted it to end. Which was how? With you broken, beaten down, ready to give up the farm and disappear into whatever small, quiet life they thought was appropriate for a widow. His jaw tightened. They've been waiting for you to fail, Mrs. Hale. Waiting for you to prove that a woman alone can't manage, that you need to be managed, controlled, taken care of. And you think differently? I think you've been managing just fine for 3 years with no help and no charity. I think you're stronger than half the men in that town. I think the only reason they want you to fail is because your success makes them uncomfortable. Caleb stood, went to the fire, stared into it. I've known a lot of strong people, Mrs. Hale. Most of them were women. The world just doesn't like admitting it. Margaret sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been building since he'd placed those gold coins on Bernard Shaw's table. Why $5? Caleb turned to look at her. Because that's what the pretty young girls get. The ones everyone falls over themselves to bid on, and you're worth just as much as any of them. He paused. More, actually. Because you earned your strength. They were just born into theirs. Something cracked open in Margaret's chest, something she'd been keeping locked down tight for 3 years. Since Thomas died. Since the loneliness became her constant companion. Since she'd learned that survival meant hardening yourself against the world. She stood abruptly, blinking hard against tears she refused to shed. I should go home. Not tonight. Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. Storm's coming in. You can see it in the sky. Horse won't make it down the mountain safely in the dark with that wind picking up. I can't stay here. It's not. People already think what they think. Staying or going won't change that. Caleb moved to the bed in the corner, started pulling off the blankets. You take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. This is your home. I can't. You can and you will. He carried the blankets to the hearth, arranged them efficiently. I've slept in worse places than a warm cabin floor, trust me. Margaret wanted to argue, but exhaustion was crashing over her in waves. The emotional toll of the evening, the ride up the mountain, the warmth of the cabin after weeks of trying to conserve firewood in her own cold house, all of it was catching up with her. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. I don't understand why you're doing this, but thank you. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You don't have to understand it. Just accept it. She nodded, moved to the bed. It was solid, well made, the mattress stuffed with something that felt like cedar boughs and dried grass. The blanket smelled like pine and smoke and clean air. Margaret lay down, still fully dressed except for her boots. The bed was comfortable, more comfortable than her own. She stared at the ceiling, listening to Caleb moving around the cabin, banking the fire, settling into his own makeshift bed. Mrs. Hale? His voice came from the darkness near the hearth. Margaret? Call me Margaret. Margaret, then. A pause. Those men who didn't bid tonight, they're fools, and come spring, when you're still standing and they're still small, they'll know it. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling something shift inside her. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile, too dangerous, but something like it, something that felt like the possibility of hope. Caleb? She said into the darkness. Yeah? Do you really think I can save the farm? Silence stretched out long enough that Margaret thought he might not answer. Then, I think you're going to fight like hell, and I think that counts for more than money. Another pause. Get some sleep. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Margaret let her eyes drift closed, exhaustion finally winning out. Outside, the wind howled and snow began to fall, but inside the cabin was warm and safe. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret Hale fell asleep feeling like she wasn't completely alone in the world. And 50 yards down the mountain trail, hidden in the trees, Two men on horseback watched the cabin with cold, calculating eyes before turning their horses back toward town and the men who'd sent them to see where the widow had gone with the mountain man. The storm was coming, and it had nothing to do with the weather. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of splitting wood. For a moment, disoriented in the gray light of early morning, she didn't know where she was. Then memory flooded back, the auction, the silence, Caleb's $5 gold ringing against Bernard Shaw's table like a declaration of war. She sat up carefully, her back protesting. The cabin was warm, the fire rebuilt to a steady burn. Through the small window, she could see fresh snow had fallen during the night, several inches of it, turning the world outside into something clean and white and deceptively peaceful. The door opened and Caleb came in carrying an armload of split wood. He saw her awake and nodded. "Coffee's ready. There's bread and butter on the table." "You've been up for hours," Margaret said, reading it in the amount of wood he'd already processed. "The organized state of the cabin." "Habit." He stacked the wood neatly by the hearth. "Storm passed. Road down the mountain should be clear enough by mid-morning." Margaret stood, smoothing her dress, suddenly self-conscious. She'd slept in her clothes, her hair was a mess. She probably looked exactly like what she was, a 53-year-old widow who'd spent the night in a strange man's cabin. "Let them talk," Caleb said, as if reading her thoughts. He poured coffee into a tin cup, handed it to her. They were already talking. Might as well give them something real to talk about. The coffee was strong and hot, and exactly what Margaret needed. She sipped it, gathering her thoughts, trying to figure out what happened next. "I need to get back to my farm," she said finally. "The animals need tending." "Sold most of them, you said." "Most, not all." Margaret set down the cup. "I've got 2 goats left, some chickens. They're hardy, but they still need care." Caleb studied her for a moment. "I'll take you down. But first you eat something, no arguing." Margaret almost smiled. "Almost, you always this bossy?" "Only when people need bossing." He cut thick slices of bread, spread them with butter. "Eat. Then we'll talk about what happens next." "What happens next is, I go home and figure out how to make $200 appear out of thin air in the next 4 months. Or," Caleb said carefully, "you let me help." Margaret's hand stilled on her cup. "You already helped. More than you should have." $5 isn't help, it's a gesture." He sat across from her, his gray eyes serious. "Real help would be making sure you keep that farm." "I can't take your money." "Didn't offer it." Margaret blinked. "Then what are you offering?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "I know things. Things about these mountains, about the men who run Redwood Hollow, things that might be useful." "What kind of things?" "The kind that explain why they want your farm so badly." He leaned back in his chair. "Your land borders the North Creek, doesn't it? The one that runs down from the high country?" "Yes. Thomas always said it was the best water source in the valley." "Thomas was right, and that creek doesn't just carry water." Caleb's expression hardened. "Last spring, I found color in the high streams. Not much, but enough to be interesting. That creek runs through your property before it hits town." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Gold? Maybe. Maybe not. But the possibility is there, and men have killed for less." Caleb stood, moved to the window, looked out at the white landscape. "Bernard Shaw and his associates. They've been buying up land quietly for the past 2 years, small parcels, pieces that don't look important on their own. But put them together, control the water rights, and suddenly you control the whole valley. And my farm is the missing piece. Your farm is the keystone. Without it, their plan doesn't work." He turned back to face her. "And so, that's why they've been patient with your debt instead of foreclosing immediately. They want you to fail on your own, make it look natural. Less questions that way." Margaret's hands tightened on her cup. "How do you know all this?" "Because I listen, because I watch. Because men who think they're alone in the mountains talk freely, and they don't notice the trapper passing through." Caleb's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "And because 2 of Shaw's men followed us up here last night. They watched this cabin for an hour before the storm drove them back to town." The bread turned to ash in Margaret's mouth. "They followed us?" "About 50 yards behind, staying in the trees. They're not subtle, and they're not particularly skilled." Caleb poured himself more coffee. "But they're persistent, and they're reporting back to Shaw, which means by now the whole town knows you spent the night up here. My reputation was already ruined the moment you stepped on that auction platform." Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "You think they care about your reputation? They care about your land. The reputation is just a tool to use against you." Margaret stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the anger building in her chest. "So what do I do? Roll over and let them take it?" "You fight. With what? I don't have money. I don't have influence. I don't have... You have me." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at Caleb, this strange man who'd appeared out of nowhere and upended her world in the space of 12 hours. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk yourself for someone you don't even know?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough, with old pain. "I had a wife once. Sarah. Strong woman, strongest I ever knew. We had a small ranch in Montana, nothing fancy, but it was ours. When I went off to the war, she kept it running. Alone. For 3 years. He paused, staring into his coffee like he could see the past in its dark surface. "I came back to find her dead. Pneumonia, they said. But she died in the middle of summer, and her grave was in the potter's field because the bank had taken the ranch 6 months earlier. Turns out the local banker had been pressuring her to sell, and when she wouldn't, he called in debts that didn't exist, forged documents, made her life hell until she broke." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I was too late to save her," Caleb continued. "Too late to stop them. Too late to do anything but bury her and walk away before I did something that would have put me in prison or worse." He looked up at Margaret then, and his eyes were full of old ghosts. "I won't be too late again. Caleb, you remind me of her, not in looks, but in the way you stand, the way you don't break even when they're doing everything they can to break you." He set down his cup with deliberate care. "So when I say I'll help you fight, I mean it, and I don't give a damn what it costs me." Margaret sat back down slowly. "What if fighting isn't enough? What if they're too powerful? Then we make sure we're more dangerous than they are powerful." Caleb's smile was sharp, predatory. "I didn't spend 3 years in the mountains doing nothing, Margaret. I learned things. About people, about leverage, about how to survive when the odds say you shouldn't. You're talking about breaking the law. I'm talking about evening the odds." He leaned forward. "They want to play dirty? We can play dirty. The difference is they have something to lose: reputation, business, standing in the community. Me? I've got nothing to lose, and that makes me very, very dangerous." Margaret should have been frightened, should have told him no, sent him away, handled this alone like she'd handled everything else. But looking at Caleb North, at the steel in his eyes and the set of his jaw, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, solid, dangerous hope. "What's the first step?" she asked. Caleb's smile widened. "First, we get you home. Let them see you're not hiding, not ashamed. Then we start gathering information, find out exactly how deep this goes, who's involved, what they're planning." He stood, began gathering supplies. "And we make sure they know you're not alone anymore." They left the cabin an hour later after Margaret had washed her face and done what she could to make herself presentable. Caleb saddled his horse, then helped Margaret mount behind him again. The ride down the mountain was slower in daylight, the snow making the trail treacherous, but it gave Margaret time to see where she'd been the night before. The cabin was situated in a natural clearing, defensible, with sight lines in all directions. A soldier's choice of location. "You fought in the war," she said. Not quite a question. 3 years? Infantry mostly. Some scouting." Caleb's voice was neutral, but Margaret felt him tense slightly. "Learned a lot of things I wish I could forget. But they're useful now. Everything's useful if you look at it right." He guided the horse around a fallen branch. "War teaches you that comfort and morality are luxuries. Survival is what matters, protecting what's yours, doing what needs doing, even when it's ugly." They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the steady crunch of hooves in snow and the occasional call of a winter bird. "My farm is 2 miles east of town," Margaret said as they neared the main road. "Small house, barn that needs repairs, About 40 acres of tillable land. I know where it is. You've been there? Rode past it a few times. Noticed how well you kept it up, considering. Caleb slowed the horse as they reached the road. Noticed other things, too, like how Shaw's men ride past your property every few days, always slowing down, always looking, taking inventory. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. How long has that been going on? Since last spring, near as I can tell, right around when your note came due the first time and you managed to scrape together enough to buy an extension. They've been waiting for me to fail. They've been planning for it. Caleb turned the horse east. But plans can be disrupted, especially when the target stops being predictable. They reached Margaret's farm just as the sun broke through the clouds. The property looked smaller in daylight, more worn than Margaret liked to admit. The fence needed mending in a dozen places. The barn listed slightly to one side. The house itself was solid enough, but the shutters were faded and one of the porch steps was cracked. 3 years of managing alone showed in every weathered board. But it was hers. Every inch of it, bought with Thomas's labor and her own, paid for in sweat and time and love. Caleb helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. I'll check the perimeter while you tend your animals. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He was already moving, his eyes scanning the property with the systematic attention of someone trained to spot threats. Do it anyway. Margaret watched him for a moment, this strange protector who'd appeared in her life like something out of a story, then headed for the small barn where her remaining animals waited. The 2 goats bleated their complaint at her late arrival. The chickens clustered around her feet, pecking at the grain she scattered. Simple creatures with simple needs depending on her to survive the winter, just like she depended on this land. She was checking the goats' water when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Margaret stepped out of the barn to see 5 men riding up her lane. She recognized them immediately. Bernard Shaw in the lead, flanked by his son Robert, and 3 other men who worked for Shaw in various capacities, all of them armed, though the weapons weren't drawn. Yet. Caleb appeared from around the side of the house, moving with deceptive casualness to position himself between Margaret and the approaching riders. His hand rested on his belt near where Margaret now noticed he wore a revolver, well used and perfectly maintained. The riders pulled up 20 feet away. Bernard Shaw's face was flushed with something that might have been anger or might have been fear, poorly disguised. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a merchant, making a sale he knew was rotten. "We need to talk." "Then talk," Margaret said, moving to stand beside Caleb despite his subtle gesture for her to stay back. "This is my property. You're welcome to state your business and leave." Bernard's smile tightened. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, there's been some concern in town about your situation. My situation is my own business, not when it affects the community." Robert Shaw spoke up, his voice harder than his father's, less practiced at pretense. "You spent last night alone with this man," he jerked his chin at Caleb, "in the mountains. That's not behavior befitting a woman of your position." "My position?" Margaret felt heat rising in her chest. "And what position is that exactly?" "A widow, a woman alone, someone who should be mindful of her reputation and the example she sets." Bernard leaned forward in his saddle. "We're prepared to be reasonable, Margaret. The town's willing to help you relocate, find appropriate lodgings, perhaps work as a housekeeper for a respectable family, in exchange for the farm." "In exchange for your dignity," Bernard corrected smoothly. "Surely you can see you can't manage this property alone. It's too much for any woman, let alone one of your years." Caleb's hand moved fractionally closer to his revolver. His voice, when he spoke, was conversational, almost friendly. "You should leave now." "This doesn't concern you, North." Robert's hand moved toward his own weapon. "This is town business." "Margaret Hale's business is her own," Caleb said, still in that same mild tone that somehow carried more threat than shouting would have. "You're on her property uninvited. That makes you trespassers. We're concerned citizens. You're vultures circling a woman you think is weak enough to rob." Caleb's eyes went flat and cold. "You're not. She's not. And if you're smart, you'll turn those horses around and ride back to town before this gets ugly." Bernard's face darkened. Are you threatening us? I'm giving you good advice. What you do with it is your choice. Caleb's hand didn't move, but something in his posture shifted, became coiled, dangerous. But I'll tell you this once, and you'd better listen close. Margaret Hale isn't alone anymore. She isn't unprotected. And anyone who tries to take what's hers is going to have to go through me first. One man against the whole town? Robert sneered. Those aren't good odds. Caleb smiled, and it was the coldest thing Margaret had ever seen. They are for me. The moment stretched out, taut as a wire. Margaret could see the calculation in Bernard's eyes, weighing options, assessing risk. Whatever he saw in Caleb's face made him pull back. This isn't over, Bernard said, gathering his reins. The banknote comes due in 4 months, Mrs. Hale. $200. If you can't pay, the law will settle this matter for us. I'll pay? With what? Another charity basket? Robert laughed. You couldn't get 25 cents last night. What makes you think? Because I have help now, Margaret said, her voice steady and clear. And because this farm is mine, bought and paid for with my husband's life and my own work. You want it? You'll have to take it from me, and I promise you, that won't be as easy as you think. Bernard's expression soured. You're making a mistake, Margaret. The only mistake I made was thinking you were decent men. Margaret took a step forward. Now get off my land. For a moment she thought they might refuse, thought this might end in violence right here, right now. But Bernard Shaw was a businessman, not a fighter, and he could read the odds as well as anyone. Come on, he said to his men. We've wasted enough time here. They turned their horses and rode away, but slowly, making sure it didn't look like retreat. Margaret watched them go, her heart hammering in her chest, adrenaline making her hands shake. When they were out of sight, Caleb finally moved his hand away from his weapon. That was brave, he said quietly. Also stupid, but brave. They were going to take it anyway, Margaret said. Might as well make them work for it. They'll be back, with more men, with legal documents, with whatever leverage they can manufacture. I know. Margaret looked at her farm, at the worn buildings and tired fences, at everything she'd fought to keep. But today they didn't win, and that's something. Caleb studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, something like respect in his eyes. We need to move fast. They'll make their play soon. Try to force the issue before you can organize any real resistance. What do you suggest? First, we make sure you're not alone here at night. I can camp in your barn, keep watch. They won't try anything if they know I'm here. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. All right, but second, we need to find out exactly what they're planning. Who's involved, what kind of pressure they're going to apply, whether there's anyone in town who might stand with you instead of against you. There's no one, Margaret said flatly. You saw that last night. Maybe, but fear makes people quiet. Doesn't mean they all agree with Shaw. Caleb glanced back toward town. There might be allies we haven't found yet. And if there aren't, then we make sure Shaw and his men have bigger problems to worry about than one widow and her farm. Caleb's smile was sharp. I told you, I learned things in the war, and I'm not afraid to use them. Margaret looked at this man who'd somehow become her protector, her partner in this fight she hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. You could walk away from this. Go back to your cabin, back to your quiet life. Why stay? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Because walking away from Sarah's fight cost me everything that mattered. I won't make that mistake twice. He met her eyes. And because you deserve better than what they're trying to do to you. Simple as that. It wasn't simple at all. But standing there in the winter sun, her farm at her back, and this dangerous stranger at her side, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt since the day they buried Thomas. She felt like she might actually survive this. All right, she said. We fight. What do we do first? Caleb's grin was fierce and wild. First, we make them understand they picked the wrong woman to push around. The first attack came 3 nights later. Margaret was in the house finishing the evening dishes when she heard Caleb's low whistle from the barn, their agreed signal that something was wrong. She dried her hands quickly, moved to the window, and saw what he'd spotted, torches moving through the trees on the eastern boundary of her property, at least 4 of them, maybe more. She grabbed the rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot years ago, checked that it was loaded, and slipped out the back door. The winter night was clear and cold, the moon bright enough to cast shadows. She could hear them now, men's voices carrying across the frozen ground, not bothering to be quiet. They thought she was alone, thought she'd be easy. Caleb materialized beside her like a ghost, moving without sound despite his size. 6 men, he breathed into her ear. Shaw's son Robert is leading them. They're heading for your barn. My animals are already moved. I put them in the root cellar an hour ago when I heard them staging up in the woods. His hand touched her shoulder, steadying. Stay behind me. Don't shoot unless you have to, but if you do, make it count. They positioned themselves behind the water trough, with clear sight lines to the barn. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the rifle. Fear was one thing. Letting fear control you was another. The men emerged from the tree line, and Margaret's stomach clenched when she saw they were carrying more than torches. 2 had cans that sloshed with liquid, kerosene most likely. They were planning to burn her out. Robert Shaw raised his hand, stopping his men 20 yards from the barn. "Mrs. Hale!" he called out, his voice slurred slightly. They'd been drinking, building their courage. "We know you're in there. Come out now, and this doesn't have to get worse." Caleb's voice cut through the darkness, low and deadly calm. "She's not in the barn, Shaw. She's right here, with a rifle pointed at your chest." The men spun around, torches swinging wildly. In the chaos of light and shadow, Margaret saw their faces clearly. Young men from town, boys she'd watched grow up. Michael Chen, Dorothy's nephew. James Pritchard, whose mother Margaret had helped through scarlet fever. Others she recognized from church, from the general store, from the fabric of normal life in Redwood Hollow. Now they were here to burn her out of her home. "North!" Robert spat the name like a curse. "This doesn't concern you." A man tries to burn down a woman's barn in the middle of the night. It concerns anyone with a conscience. Caleb stood slowly, and Margaret saw he had his revolver drawn, held low but ready. "You boys should go home before this turns into something you can't take back." "We're not boys," Michael Chen said, but his voice shook slightly. "We're here on official business." "Official business," Caleb repeated, his tone mocking. "Is that what we're calling arson now? Your uncle know you're here, Michael? Your mother?" Michael's torch wavered. "Here's what's going to happen," Caleb continued, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "You're going to set down those torches, you're going to leave those kerosene cans right where they are, and you're going to walk off this property. Now." "Or what?" Robert took a step forward, emboldened by numbers. "You'll shoot all 6 of us? Even you're not that good, North." "I don't have to be good, I just have to be fast." Caleb's revolver came up, and even in the torchlight, Margaret could see the absolute steadiness of his hand. "First bullet goes through your knee, Robert. Second through your gun hand. By the time you hit the ground screaming, I'll have reloaded and started on your friends. Question is, how many of them are willing to die for your father's greed?" The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of torches and someone's nervous breathing. "You're bluffing," Robert said, but there was no conviction in it. "Try me." 2 words, flat and certain, carrying the weight of a man who'd killed before and would kill again if necessary. Margaret saw the moment Robert's courage cracked, saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the fractional step backward he tried to hide. But then James Pritchard spoke up, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or might have been hate. "We can't just leave. Mr. Shaw said—" "I don't care what Shaw said." Caleb's gun never wavered. "I care that you're trespassing with intent to destroy property. That's a crime. And out here, in the dark, far from town, witnesses get scarce. Accidents happen." "You threatening us?" Robert tried to salvage some authority. "I'm explaining reality." Caleb took a step forward. "You came here to terrorize a widow, to burn her livelihood because she wouldn't roll over and die when convenient. You think that makes you men? You're cowards, every single one of you." "We're trying to help her," Michael said desperately. "Help her see reason before—" "Before what?" Margaret spoke for the first time, and her voice cut through the night like a blade. She stood, bringing the rifle to her shoulder, sighting down the barrel at Robert Shaw. "Before you burn me out? Force me off my land? Take everything I have left of my husband, my life, my work?" She walked forward slowly, and the men actually backed up. Something about a 53-year-old widow with a rifle and nothing left to lose made even drunk young men reconsider their choices. I watched most of you grow up, Margaret continued. I brought food when your families were sick. I helped your mothers with harvest, with births, with burials. And this is how you repay that? By coming in the night with torches and kerosene? Mrs. Hale, we don't want trouble, James started. Then you shouldn't have brought it to my door. Margaret's finger rested on the trigger, and she meant every word of what came next. I'm done being reasonable, done being quiet, done pretending that if I'm just small enough, invisible enough, you'll leave me alone. This is my land, my home. And if you want it, you'll have to kill me for it. Right here, right now. Is that what you came for? No one moved. No one spoke. That's what I thought. Margaret lowered the rifle slightly but kept it ready. Now get off my property. And you tell Bernard Shaw that if he wants this farm, he can come himself next time instead of sending children to do his dirty work. You're making a mistake, Robert said, but he was already backing toward the trees. My father has the law on his side. The bank, the town council. Your father has money on his side, Caleb interrupted. That's not the same as being right. Now move, before I decide that your knee really would look better with a hole in it. They went, slowly trying to maintain some dignity, but they went. The torches disappeared into the trees, and the sound of horses moving away filtered through the night. Margaret didn't lower the rifle until the last sound faded. Then her hands started shaking, and Caleb was there, gently taking the weapon, guiding her to sit on the water trough. You did good, he said quietly. I wanted to shoot him. Margaret's voice was rough. Robert Shaw, standing there so smug, so certain he had the right to destroy my life. I wanted to put a bullet through him. But you didn't, that's what matters. Is it? Margaret looked up at him. They'll be back, with more men, or the law, or something worse. We both know it. Yeah. Caleb sat beside her. But not tonight. Tonight, you won. Margaret laughed, a sound without humor. Some victory. I get to keep my barn for another few days. You showed them you're not afraid. That's worth more than you think. Caleb checked his revolver, reloaded the chamber he'd fired into the ground earlier to prove it was loaded. Fear is their biggest weapon. They wanted you scared, compliant, ready to give up. Instead, you stood up with a rifle and dared them to follow through. That changes things. Changes them how? Makes it real. Makes it personal. Before, you were just an obstacle to remove. Now you're a person fighting back. That's harder to justify, harder to stomach. He paused. Some of those boys won't come back, maybe all of them. Shaw will have to find men with harder hearts and emptier consciences. Men like that exist. They do. But they cost more. And every dollar Shaw spends on this fight is a dollar he can't spend somewhere else. We make him bleed money, bleed patience, bleed support. Eventually, something breaks. Margaret wanted to believe him, but she'd lived too long, lost too much, to trust in easy victories. What if what breaks is me? Caleb turned to look at her, his gray eyes catching the moonlight. Then I'll put you back together, as many times as it takes. The simple certainty in his voice did something to Margaret's carefully constructed walls. She'd been so strong for so long, had to be strong, had no choice but strength. But sitting there in the cold darkness with this dangerous stranger who'd somehow become her anchor, she felt the weight of 3 years of loneliness and grief and desperate survival crash over her. I'm tired, Caleb, she whispered. I'm so tired of fighting. I know. His hand found hers in the darkness, rough and warm and solid. But you're not fighting alone anymore. That's the difference. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the pines, to the small sounds of the farm settling around them. Then Caleb stood, pulling her gently to her feet. Come on, you need sleep. I'll keep watch. You need sleep too. I'm used to going without. Military training has some benefits. He walked her to the house, checked inside quickly with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd cleared buildings in war. Lock the door. Don't open it unless you hear my voice. If anything happens, there's a loose board under your bed. Pull it up, and there's a crawl space that leads to the root cellar. You can get out that way if you need to. Margaret stared at him, When did you? Day before yesterday, while you were in town getting supplies. Figured it was better to have an escape route and not need it than need it and not have it. He handed her the rifle. Keep this close. I'll be in the barn. Caleb. She caught his arm before he could leave. Thank you. For all of it. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded and disappeared into the night. Margaret locked the door, checked the windows, and went to bed fully clothed with the rifle beside her. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by every creak and groan of the old house settling, every gust of wind against the shutters. When dawn finally came, she found Caleb already up, already working. He'd reinforced the barn door, fixed the weak spot in the fence where the men had come through, and was currently nailing boards across the windows of the small shed where she kept her tools. Making it harder for them next time, he explained when she brought him coffee. They want to burn something. They'll have to work for it. Margaret watched him work. This man who'd appeared in her life like some kind of avenging angel and immediately set about making himself indispensable. You can't stay here forever. Why not? Because you have your own life. Your cabin, your trap lines. Can wait. Caleb drove another nail home with 3 precise strikes. Nothing up there that can't keep for a few months. A few months? Caleb, the banknote isn't due for 4 months. You can't put your life on hold that long. He set down the hammer, turned to face her. Margaret, my life is trapping animals and selling fur and living alone in a cabin in the mountains. If I'm being honest, it's not much of a life. It's existence. It's survival. It's what I do because I don't know what else to do. He paused. But this? Helping you fight Shaw, making sure you keep what's yours? This feels like something that matters. First time in years I felt like I'm doing something worth doing. You're doing it because of your wife, because you couldn't save her. Started that way, maybe. Caleb's eyes met hers, steady and sure. But I'm staying because of you, because you deserve better than what they're trying to do to you, and because somewhere along the way, your fight became my fight too. Margaret didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to process the fact that this stranger cared more about her welfare than people who'd known her for decades. Before she could find words, they heard a horse approaching. Just one this time, moving slowly. Caleb's hand went to his revolver, but he relaxed fractionally when he saw who it was. Dorothy Chen dismounted at the fence line, her face troubled. Mrs. Hale, Mr. North, can I talk to you? Margaret walked to meet her, surprised. Dorothy had been kind at the auction, but they weren't close friends. Of course, what's wrong? Everything. Dorothy glanced back toward town, nervous. Can we go inside? I don't want anyone seeing me here. They settled in Margaret's small kitchen, Dorothy refusing tea, her hands twisted in her lap. I came to warn you. Bernard Shaw is meeting with the town council this afternoon. He's going to petition them to declare your farm abandoned. Abandoned? Margaret felt cold fury rise in her chest. I live here. I work this land. How can it be abandoned? He's going to claim you're not maintaining it properly, that it's becoming a danger to neighboring properties, a blight on the community. Dorothy's voice was miserable. He has statements from people willing to testify that the buildings are falling apart, that you're not capable of managing the property, that you're, I'm sorry, Margaret, that you're of questionable moral character now because of, well, because she spent a night in my cabin during a snowstorm, Caleb said flatly. That's what they're calling questionable moral character. Dorothy nodded, not meeting their eyes. If the council agrees, they can seize the property under public interest laws, sell it at auction to pay your debts, with anything left over going to you. Except there won't be anything left over because Shaw will make sure of it. Can they do that? Margaret's voice was steady despite the panic rising in her chest. Legally? They can if the council votes for it, and Shaw has 4 of the 7 council members in his pocket. Dorothy finally looked up. I'm sorry. I know I should have said something before, should have stood up for you at the auction, but I was scared. David works for Shaw at the Mercantile, and if he loses that job, I understand. And Margaret did, even as it hurt. Fear made people small, made them quiet. She couldn't blame Dorothy for protecting her family. There's more. Dorothy pulled a folded paper from her coat. This is a copy of the banknote on your property. Michael, my nephew, he felt terrible about last night. He gave this to me, told me to get it to you. Look at the signature. Margaret unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the document until she found it. Her breath caught. This isn't Thomas's signature. No. Dorothy's voice was grim. That's a forgery. And if you look at the date, it's from 6 months after Thomas died. He couldn't have signed it because he was already in the ground. Caleb leaned over Margaret's shoulder, studying the document. Shaw forged this, created a debt that never existed. Or increased one that did, Dorothy said. I don't know which, but either way it means the note might not be legal, which means the whole foreclosure might not be legal. Hope flared in Margaret's chest, bright and dangerous. If I can prove this is forged, Shaw will destroy you before you get the chance. Dorothy stood, agitated. You think he's been playing fair? He has the sheriff on his side, half the judges in the county. If you accuse him publicly, he'll bury you in legal proceedings until you run out of money and time and options. Then what do I do? Margaret felt the hope guttering out as fast as it had ignited. You fight dirty. Dorothy's voice was quiet but fierce. You find leverage. You make him more afraid of you than you are of him. She looked at Caleb. That's why I came to you, Mr. North. Everyone knows what you were before you came to these mountains. Everyone knows what you're capable of. Caleb's expression went carefully neutral. What exactly do people say I was? A soldier, a scout, maybe something more than that. Dorothy met his eyes. Someone who knows how to find information, how to hurt people without leaving marks, how to make problems disappear. I'm not that person anymore. Maybe not. But the skills don't go away, do they? Dorothy moved to the door, paused with her hand on the knob. Shaw has secrets, bad ones, the kind that would ruin him if they came to light. Find them. Use them. Because if you don't, Margaret loses everything, and Shaw moves on to the next piece of land, the next victim. She left as quickly as she'd come, and Margaret and Caleb sat in silence, staring at the forged document on the table between them. She's right, Caleb said finally. We need leverage. Something that makes Shaw back off permanently, not just for a few weeks. How do we find that? By going places we're not supposed to go, asking questions we're not supposed to ask, and making connections we're not supposed to make. Caleb stood, started gathering supplies. I'll go into town tonight. Shaw's office, his home, anywhere he might keep records. If he's been doing this to you, he's probably done it to others. And if he's forging documents, there'll be evidence somewhere. That's burglary. If you're caught, then I'll deal with it. Caleb checked his revolver, slipped a knife into his boot. But I won't be caught. I've done this kind of thing before in the war. Reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, I'm good at it. Margaret stood, moved to stand in front of him. I can't ask you to risk yourself like this. You're not asking. I'm volunteering. His hand came up, cupped her face gently. Margaret, listen to me. Shaw is going to take your farm unless we stop him. The law won't help you because he owns the law. Your neighbors won't help you because they're too scared. That leaves us. And I'm not afraid of Bernard Shaw or his hired men or his forged documents. I'm only afraid of watching you lose everything and knowing I didn't do enough to stop it. She saw it then in his eyes, the truth he'd been dancing around for days. He cared about her, not because she reminded him of his dead wife, not because he felt guilty about the past. He cared about her, Margaret Hale, in all her worn-out, stubborn, fierce determination to survive. Be careful, she whispered. Always am. He smiled, but there was steel behind it. You lock up tight tonight. Don't open the door for anyone. I'll be back before dawn. He left her there in the kitchen with the forged document and a rifle and the terrifying knowledge that the fight had just escalated beyond anything she'd imagined. That night, Margaret did exactly as Caleb asked. She locked the doors, barred the windows, kept the rifle close. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, every sound outside making her heart jump. Midnight came and went. Then 1 a.m, 2. At 3, she heard gunshots in the distance coming from the direction of town. 4 shots, rapid succession, then silence. Margaret stood at the window, rifle in hand, staring into the darkness and praying to anyone who'd listened that Caleb was alive, was safe, was coming back. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when she heard a horse approaching fast. She moved to the door, rifle raised, and waited. Margaret, It's me. Open up. She yanked the door open to find Caleb on his horse, blood soaking through his left shoulder, his face pale but determined. He had a leather satchel strapped across his chest, bulging with papers. I got it, he said, and his voice was tight with pain. Everything we need. But we've got maybe an hour before Shaw figures out what happened, and then all hell is going to break loose. Margaret pulled him inside, her hands already working to help him down from the saddle, her mind racing through everything she knew about treating bullet wounds. The war had come to her door, and she was done running from it. Margaret's hands worked with steady precision despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She'd cut away Caleb's shirt, exposing the wound, a clean through and through in the meat of his shoulder, missing bone and major vessels by what looked like inches. You were lucky, she said, pressing a cloth against the entry wound while her other hand worked on the exit. Another 2 inches and this would have hit your lung. Wasn't luck? Caleb's voice was strained but clear. The shooter was aiming for center mass. I moved. While being shot at. Margaret poured whiskey over the wound, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. What happened? Got into Shaw's office through a back window, found his safe behind a painting, original hiding spot there, and got it open. Caleb gestured toward the satchel he dropped on the table. Documents going back 5 years. Forged deeds, falsified debts, letters to county officials that amount to bribery. He's been systematically stealing land from anyone vulnerable enough to target. Margaret began wrapping his shoulder with strips of clean linen, pulling them tight enough to stop the bleeding, but not so tight they'd cut off circulation. And the shooting? Robert Shaw came back to the office. Probably forgot something, or maybe he couldn't sleep with guilt eating at him after last night. Caleb winced as Margaret tied off the bandage. He saw me coming out the window, drew on me. I returned fire, hit the wall above his head, scared him enough that his shot went wide, caught me here instead of where he was aiming. You could have killed him. Yeah. Caleb met her eyes. But killing Bernard Shaw's son would have made this about murder instead of land theft. Would have given them exactly the excuse they needed to come after you with the full weight of the law. Margaret finished with the bandage, sat back on her heels. 3 years of farm work had taught her basic field medicine. Animals got hurt, and the nearest doctor was an hour away, but treating a bullet wound on a man was different, more personal, more terrifying. Can you ride? She asked. Have to, don't I? Caleb stood carefully, testing his shoulder. We need to get to the county seat before Shaw can spin this his way. Get these documents in front of someone who isn't in his pocket. The county seat is 30 miles. You're bleeding. Already stopped, mostly. You do good work. He picked up the satchel, started sorting through papers with his good hand. Look at this. Here's the forged note on your property, and here's 3 others just like it. Widows, all of them. Sarah Kemp, whose husband died in a mining accident. Helen Vargas, whose husband took sick with pneumonia. Jane Morrison, lost hers to a heart attack. Margaret took the papers, her hand shaking with fury as she read. Each one showed the same pattern. A husband dies, a few months later a new debt appears with a forged signature, and within a year the widow is forced off her land. Shaw had been doing this for years, and no one had stopped him because no one had proof. Until now. There's more, Caleb said, pulling out another set of documents. Letters from Shaw to the Territorial Mining Office. He's been reporting gold strikes on land he doesn't own yet, getting mineral rights assigned to dummy corporations he controls. Once he has the rights, he forces out the landowners and claims everything. That's fraud. That's a hanging offense if we can prove it in territorial court. Caleb's smile was grim. And we can prove it now. These documents are enough to bring down Shaw, his associates, and probably half the town council. Margaret looked at the papers spread across her kitchen table. Evidence of years of theft, corruption, lives destroyed for profit. She thought about those other widows. Wondered if they'd fought like she was fighting. Wondered if they'd had anyone stand with them, or if they'd faced Shaw's machine alone. We need to go now, she said, decision crystallizing, before Shaw realizes what you took and tries to stop us. You should stay here, keep the rifle, guard the farm. No, Margaret's voice was iron. This is my fight. These are my documents now, and I'm not sending you off wounded while I hide here hoping for the best. She grabbed her coat, started loading supplies into a pack. Besides, You need someone to keep you upright if you start bleeding again. Caleb watched her for a moment, something like pride in his eyes. You're going to ride 30 miles with a wanted man who just burgled the most powerful person in the county, probably getting yourself arrested in the process, all to protect a farm that might be lost anyway. That about sum it up? Margaret shoved bread and dried meat into the pack, added bandages and the whiskey bottle. Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most stubborn. Can it be both? She slung the pack over her shoulder, picked up the satchel of documents. Now come on, we're burning daylight, and I want to be at the county seat before Shaw figures out how to chase us. They were saddling the horses when Margaret saw the dust rising on the road from town. A lot of dust, meaning a lot of riders moving fast. They know, Caleb said, his voice tight. Shaw must have found his office broken into, put it together. How many? Can't tell from here. 10, maybe 15. He checked his revolver, wincing as the movement pulled his shoulder. Too many to fight through, even if I wasn't shot. Margaret's mind raced through options. The main road to the county seat went through town. They'd ride straight into Shaw's men. The mountain pass was closed this time of year, too much snow. That left the southern route, which was longer and rougher, but might be their only chance. South Road, she said, through the canyon and around Miller's Ridge. It'll add 6 hours, but we'll avoid town completely. That road washes out in winter, might not be passable. Then we'll find out when we get there. Margaret swung onto her horse, settled the satchel carefully. You have a better idea? Caleb mounted his own horse, his face pale but determined. South Road it is. They rode hard, pushing the horses as much as they dared on the frozen ground. Behind them, Margaret could hear the riders spreading out, some heading toward the farm, others likely moving to cut off the main road. Shaw was mobilizing every resource he had. The South Road was as bad as Margaret remembered, narrow, icy, bordered by steep drops that would kill anyone unlucky enough to go over. The horses picked their way carefully, and Margaret's heart hammered with every slip, every stumble. 2 hours in, Caleb started to sway in his saddle. Margaret pulled alongside him, saw fresh blood seeping through the bandage. We need to stop, she said. Can't. They're too close. If you fall off that horse and break your neck, these documents won't matter. Margaret spotted a small cave cut into the cliff face, partially hidden by scrub pine. There. 15 minutes to rebandage that shoulder and let the horses rest. Caleb didn't have the strength to argue. They dismounted, led the horses into the shallow cave. Margaret worked quickly, replacing the blood-soaked bandages with fresh ones, giving Caleb water and some of the dried meat. You should leave me, he said quietly. Take the documents and go. I'll hold them off here, buy you time. Don't be stupid. Margaret tied off the new bandage harder than necessary, making him grunt. You think I came this far to leave you bleeding in a cave? We finish this together or not at all? Margaret, no. She met his eyes, saw the pain there, the exhaustion, but also something else. Something that made her heart twist in her chest. You stood up for me when no one else would. You fought for me. You got shot for me. I'm not abandoning you now. I didn't do it for gratitude. I know why you did it. Margaret's hand touched his face, rough and gentle at once. And that's exactly why I'm not leaving. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Margaret felt something shift between them. Something that had been building since that first night in his cabin, since he'd placed $5 gold on Bernard Shaw's table, since he'd stood between her and an angry mob with nothing but conviction and a loaded gun. The sound of horses on the road below shattered the moment. Margaret moved to the cave entrance, peered out carefully. 5 riders moving slowly, studying the ground for tracks. Shaw's men hunting. Caleb joined her, his good hand on his revolver. If they see our tracks leading in here, we're trapped. Then we make sure they don't see them. Margaret scanned the area, spotted what she needed, a dead pine branch, heavy with old needles. She crawled out of the cave, staying low, and used the branch to sweep over their tracks, obscuring them with loose snow and debris. The riders passed within 20 feet, close enough that Margaret could hear their conversation. They couldn't have gotten far. North's wounded, and the woman's old. Shaw wants them found before they reach the county seat. Says there's $100 for the man who brings them in. Dead or alive? A pause. Didn't specify, but I don't think he'd complain if North didn't make it back breathing. They moved on, and Margaret waited a full 10 minutes before crawling back into the cave. Caleb was standing despite the pain, his revolver drawn, ready to fight if she'd been discovered. "They're gone," she said, "but they'll be back once they realize we're not ahead of them on the road. We need to move, now." They mounted up again, this time moving even more carefully, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. The sun climbed higher, and Margaret's body ached from tension and cold and fear. But she kept moving, kept the horse steady, kept her eyes on the road ahead. Midday found them at the canyon narrows, where the road crossed a stream via a wooden bridge that looked like it had been there since the territory was settled. The bridge was old, weathered, and currently covered in ice. "We'll have to walk the horses across," Caleb said. "Too dangerous to ride." Margaret dismounted, tested the bridge with her foot. The wood groaned, but held. "One at a time. You first. If that shoulder gives out halfway across, I need to be behind you to help." Caleb didn't argue. He started across, leading his horse, each step deliberate and careful. Margaret watched, her breath caught in her throat, until he reached the other side safely. Her turn. She stepped onto the bridge, felt it sway slightly under her weight and the horses. Halfway across, she heard it, the crack of wood beginning to fail. She froze. "Keep moving," Caleb called. "Don't stop. The weight distribution will make it worse." Margaret forced herself forward, felt the bridge shudder with each step. 3/4 across, another crack, louder this time. The horse spooked, yanked backward, and Margaret felt the board beneath her foot give way. She grabbed for the rope railing with one hand, the horse's reins with the other. The horse screamed, its hooves scrambling for purchase on the icy wood. If it fell, it would take her with it, and the drop to the frozen stream below was at least 30 feet onto rocks. Then Caleb was there, somehow across the broken section, his wounded arm forgotten as he grabbed the horse's bridle with one hand and Margaret's coat with the other. "I've got you. Let go of the reins." "The horse. I've got the horse too. Let go." Margaret released the reins and Caleb hauled backward with strength that shouldn't have been possible for a man who'd been shot 4 hours ago. The horse lurched forward, found solid footing, and scrambled the rest of the way across. Caleb pulled Margaret after it, and they all collapsed on solid ground on the far side, breathing hard. "That was too close," Margaret managed. "Story of this whole damn day." Caleb sat up slowly, his face gray with pain. Fresh blood had soaked through the bandage again. "But we made it, and Shaw's men can't follow now. That bridge won't hold anything heavier than a rabbit after what we just did to it." He was right. Looking back, Margaret could see the bridge sagging dangerously, several boards completely broken through. It had bought them time, maybe an hour, maybe more. "Can you keep riding?" she asked. "Have to." Caleb let her help him stand. "County seat is still 12 miles. We can make it by dark if we push." They rode through the afternoon, and Margaret watched Caleb get progressively weaker. He stayed upright through sheer stubbornness, but she could see the cost in every rigid line of his body, every careful breath. The sun was setting when they finally saw the county seat ahead, a larger town than Redwood Hollow, with actual streets, a courthouse, a hotel. Civilization, law, the possibility of justice. They rode straight to the courthouse, where a sheriff's deputy was locking up for the evening. Margaret dismounted, grabbed the satchel, and marched up the steps with Caleb behind her. "I need to see the territorial judge," she said. "Tonight, it's urgent." The deputy looked at them, a middle-aged woman covered in road dust and a wounded man barely staying upright, and frowned. "Court's closed. Come back Monday." "This can't wait until Monday." Margaret opened the satchel, pulled out the documents. "I have evidence of systematic land fraud, forgery, and corruption involving multiple deaths and stolen properties. The man responsible is named Bernard Shaw, and he's probably 12 hours behind us with men willing to kill to get these papers back." The deputy's hand moved toward his gun. "Ma'am, are you telling me you're being pursued by armed men?" "I'm telling you that we have proof of crimes that need to be addressed immediately, before the evidence can be destroyed or we can be silenced." Margaret's voice was steady, clear, carrying the weight of every mile they'd ridden, every risk they'd taken. "Now either get the judge, or get someone who has the authority to accept this evidence into official custody, because I'm not leaving this building until one of those things happens." The deputy studied her face, then Caleb's, then the blood-soaked bandage. "Wait here." He disappeared inside. Margaret and Caleb waited on the courthouse steps, exhaustion crashing over them now that they'd finally stopped moving. Caleb leaned against the wall, his face pale in the fading light. "You did it," he said quietly. "Got us here alive." "We did it." Margaret took his good hand, held it tight. "Both of us." The door opened and a man in his 60s emerged, dressed in formal clothes with a judge's bearing. "I'm Judge Harrison. Deputy says you have evidence of crimes?" "Yes, sir." Margaret handed him the satchel. "Everything's in there. Forged documents, falsified debts, evidence of a conspiracy to defraud widows of their land holdings. The man behind it is Bernard Shaw of Redwood Hollow." Judge Harrison pulled out papers, began reading. His expression darkened with each document. "These are serious accusations. They're true accusations." Margaret stood straight despite her exhaustion. "And I'm willing to testify to everything I know, everything I've experienced. But first, this man needs a doctor. He was shot tonight getting those documents." "Shot?" The judge's eyes sharpened. "By whom?" "Robert Shaw, Bernard's son." Caleb's voice was rough but clear. "He caught me breaking into his father's office. I returned fire but didn't hit him, didn't want to kill anyone, just wanted the proof." "You're admitting to burglary." "I'm admitting to exposing a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for years under color of law." Caleb straightened, met the judge's eyes. "Charge me if you want, Your Honor, but read those documents first, because what's in there is worth a lot more than one count of breaking and entering." Judge Harrison studied them both for a long moment. Then he turned to the deputy. "Get these people inside. Feed them, get the man to a doctor, and post guards on all the entrances. No one comes in or out without my personal authorization." He tucked the satchel under his arm. "I'll be in my chambers reviewing evidence. If it's as bad as it looks, I'll be issuing warrants by morning." They were led inside, given food and water, and a doctor was summoned to properly treat Caleb's wound. Margaret sat with him while the doctor worked, her hand in his, neither of them speaking. Words seemed inadequate for what they'd been through. It was near midnight when Judge Harrison emerged from his chambers, his face grim. "I've reviewed everything. It's worse than you described, Mrs. Hale. Much worse. Shaw's been systematically defrauding landowners across 3 counties for the better part of a decade." "Can you stop him?" Margaret asked. "I'm issuing arrest warrants for Bernard Shaw, his son Robert, and 4 other conspirators named in these documents. I'm also issuing an injunction preventing any property seizures or sales related to the fraudulent debts until this matter is fully investigated." The judge paused. "This is going to shake Redwood Hollow to its foundations." "Good," Margaret said quietly. "It should." "There's one more thing." Judge Harrison pulled out a specific document. "This is the note on your property. It's clearly forged. The signature doesn't match your husband's hand on his will, which I pulled from county records for comparison. As of now, this debt is void. Your property is clear." The words took a moment to penetrate Margaret's exhausted mind. When they did, she felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but releasing. 3 years of pressure, of fear, of desperate struggle to keep her head above water. It was over. "However," the judge continued, "you should know that Bernard Shaw will likely contest this. He has resources, connections. This will be a fight." "Then it's a fight I'll have." Margaret stood, her spine straight, her voice unwavering. "And this time, I'll have the law on my side." Judge Harrison smiled slightly. "Yes, ma'am, you will." They spent the night in the courthouse under guard. In the morning, Margaret woke to find Caleb sitting up, his shoulder properly bandaged, color returning to his face. The doctor had said he'd heal clean if he took it easy for a few weeks. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I got shot and then rode 30 miles. He smiled. "But alive. Thanks to you." "Thanks to us," Margaret corrected. "You got the evidence. I got us here. We did this together." "Yeah." Caleb's hand found hers. "We did." The deputy appeared at the door. "Mrs. Hale? Judge wants to see you." Judge Harrison was in his chambers with a sheriff and 2 deputies. "Mrs. Hale, we're riding to Redwood Hollow this morning to execute the arrest warrants. I'd like you to come with us." "Why?" Because Bernard Shaw needs to see that you're the reason his empire is falling, needs to understand that the woman he tried to break is the one who broke him. The judge's eyes were hard. And because those other widows deserve to see that justice exists, even if it comes late. Margaret thought about Sarah Kemp, Helen Vargas, Jane Morrison, women whose names she'd read on forged documents, whose homes had been stolen, whose lives had been destroyed. I'll come. They rode into Redwood Hollow at noon, when the sun was high and the whole town was awake to see it. 24 armed deputies surrounded the sheriff and judge, with Margaret riding between them, her back straight, her head high. The town square emptied as people came out to watch. Margaret saw their faces: shock, confusion, fear. Saw Dorothy Chen standing outside the mercantile, tears streaming down her face. Saw Michael Chen beside his aunt, his expression stricken with guilt and relief. Judge Harrison dismounted in front of Bernard Shaw's office. The door opened and Bernard emerged, his face composed, confident. He still thought he could talk his way out of this. Judge Harrison, to what do we owe the pleasure? Bernard Shaw, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud landowners, and bribery of public officials. The judge nodded to the deputies. Take him. Shaw's face went white. This is absurd. On whose authority? On the authority of the territory of Montana and based on evidence provided by Mrs. Margaret Hale. The judge gestured to Margaret. The woman you tried to destroy saved your victims instead. Shaw's eyes found Margaret, and she saw it happen, saw the moment he realized he'd lost, that the quiet widow he'd dismissed, the woman he'd tried to erase, had been the one to bring him down. You have no proof, he said, but his voice shook. We have all the proof we need. Your own documents, your own hand, your own greed. Judge Harrison's voice carried across the square. And not just against Mrs. Hale. Sarah Kemp, Helen Vargas, Jane Morrison, all of them victims of your fraud, all of them entitled to restitution. The deputies moved forward, and Bernard Shaw, the most powerful man in Redwood Hollow, the man who'd controlled the town for a decade, was placed in handcuffs. His son Robert was arrested trying to flee through the back of the mercantile. 4 other men named in the documents were taken into custody within the hour. By sunset, Shaw's conspiracy had been dismantled, his assets frozen, his power broken. Margaret stood in the town square and watched it happen. This woman who'd been written off, dismissed, told she was too old and too alone to matter. Around her, people were beginning to understand what had occurred, beginning to process the fact that Bernard Shaw had been stealing from them for years. Dorothy Chen approached slowly, her hands twisted in her apron. Margaret, I'm so sorry. I should have. You did what you could, Margaret said quietly. You warned me. You gave me that document. That was enough. Will you forgive us? The town? Margaret looked at the faces surrounding her, people she'd known for decades, people who'd stood silent while Shaw tried to destroy her, people who'd only found their courage once someone else had taken the risk. Ask me again in a year, she said, when I see what kind of town this becomes without Shaw running it. She turned and found Caleb standing beside his horse, watching her with those steady gray eyes. Ready to go home? He asked. Home. Her farm, her land, finally and truly hers, without the shadow of debt hanging over it. Yes, Margaret said. I'm ready. They rode out of town together, and Margaret didn't look back. The farm looked different when they returned, though nothing physical had changed. The same worn fence, the same listing barn, the same tired house that needed repairs Margaret couldn't afford. But it felt different now. No longer a burden she was desperate to keep, but something she'd fought for and won. Something that was truly, completely hers. Caleb helped her dismount, his wounded shoulder making the movement awkward but manageable. The doctor had said he'd need weeks to heal properly, and Margaret had already decided he'd spend those weeks here, where she could make sure he followed orders. I should get back to my cabin, Caleb said, as if reading her thoughts. Let you have your space back. Your shoulder needs tending, daily bandage changes, watching for infection. Margaret picked up the satchel they'd brought back from the county seat, now significantly lighter without all the incriminating documents. You'll stay here until the doctor clears you. Margaret, that's not a request. She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him stop arguing. "You took a bullet for me, Caleb North. The least I can do is make sure you heal properly from it." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "A week, maybe 2. Then I'm out of your hair." "We'll see," was all Margaret said, but they both knew what she meant. They fell into a routine over the following days. Caleb slept in the barn despite Margaret's protests, saying it wasn't proper for him to be in the house overnight even if circumstances were unusual. During the day, he did what work he could one-handed, mending fence, organizing the tool shed, chopping wood in careful, measured swings that wouldn't stress his shoulder. Margaret tended her animals, worked on winter preparations, and tried not to think too hard about what would happen when Caleb's shoulder healed and he had no more excuse to stay. 4 days after their return, Dorothy Chen appeared at the farm with a basket of food and an expression that suggested she'd been working up the courage to come for some time. "I won't stay long," she said when Margaret opened the door. "I just wanted to bring you this and to tell you what's been happening in town." Margaret invited her in, made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table like they'd done 100 times before Shaw's conspiracy had come to light. "The council held an emergency meeting," Dorothy said, her hands wrapped around the teacup for warmth. 3 of Shaw's associates resigned before they could be removed. The territorial marshal came and took statements from everyone. And they found more victims, 8 more families Shaw had defrauded over the years. 8 more, Margaret repeated softly. 8 more lives disrupted, homes lost, futures stolen. Judge Harrison says the restitution process will take months, maybe a year, but he's appointed a special administrator to oversee returning properties to their rightful owners. Dorothy met Margaret's eyes. "You saved them, all of them, by being brave enough to fight when no one else would." "I had help." Margaret glanced toward the window, where she could see Caleb working on the fence despite his injury. "I couldn't have done it alone." "No one should have to." Dorothy set down her teacup. "Margaret, I know an apology doesn't fix what happened at that auction, doesn't erase the silence or the way we all stood by while Shaw tried to destroy you. But I am sorry, truly sorry." "I know you are." Margaret reached across the table, squeezed Dorothy's hand. "And I appreciate you coming here to say it. That takes courage, too." Dorothy left an hour later, and over the following weeks, others came. Some brought food, some brought apologies, some just came to see if the rumors were true, that Margaret Hale had really brought down Bernard Shaw and his entire operation. Michael Chen came with his head down and his voice shaking, apologizing for the night he'd come with torches and kerosene, saying he'd been young and stupid and thought Shaw's authority meant Shaw was right. Margaret forgave him, told him the real measure of a man wasn't the mistakes he made, but what he did after making them. James Pritchard came with his mother Sarah, both of them tearful, both of them grateful that Margaret had exposed Shaw before he could steal from more families. Sarah had been one of the widows whose forged documents had been in Shaw's files, though she'd managed to scrape together money to pay the false debt before losing her home. Even Bernard Shaw's wife Eleanor came, a thin woman who'd aged decades in the 2 weeks since her husband's arrest. She didn't apologize. Margaret suspected Eleanor had known nothing of Bernard's crimes, but she thanked Margaret quietly for not including her in the public condemnation, for letting her keep some dignity in the wreckage of her life. Through it all, Caleb stayed. His shoulder healed slowly but cleanly, the bandages coming off after 10 days, the stitches another week after that. He regained full range of motion gradually, and Margaret watched him get stronger day by day. And day by day, she dreaded the moment when he'd be well enough to leave. It came on a Tuesday morning 4 weeks after the arrests, when the first real signs of spring were beginning to show despite the lingering cold. Margaret was in the kitchen making breakfast when Caleb came in from the barn, moving without stiffness or pain for the first time since he'd been shot. "Shoulder feels good," he said, rolling it experimentally, "almost back to normal." "That's wonderful," Margaret said, and meant it, even as her heart sank. "Which means I should probably head back to my cabin soon. Traplines need checking, winter furs need processing." He poured himself coffee, not meeting her eyes. "Can't impose on your hospitality forever." "You're not imposing." Margaret set down the pan harder than necessary. "You've been working this farm as hard as I have, doing repairs I couldn't manage alone. That's not imposing, that's partnership." Caleb looked at her then, something complicated in his gray eyes. Margaret, don't. She held up a hand. Don't tell me you need to go back to your solitary life in the mountains. Don't tell me this was always temporary. Don't tell me I should find some nice widow to keep me company or hire a farmhand to help with the work. That's not what I was going to say. Then what were you going to say? Caleb set down his coffee cup with careful precision. I was going to say that I don't know how to do this. Be with someone. Stay in one place. Build a life instead of just surviving day to day. His voice was rough with emotion. I've been alone for so long, Margaret, since before Sarah died, if I'm honest. The war hollowed me out, and I never figured out how to be whole again. Margaret moved around the table to stand in front of him. You think I know how to do this? I was married for 27 years to a good man, and when he died, I thought that part of my life was over. Thought I'd just work the farm until my body gave out, and that would be enough. She reached up, touched his face. But then you walked into that auction hall and paid $5 gold for a basket worth 75 cents, and you looked at me like I mattered, like I was worth fighting for, and I haven't felt that way in 3 years. You matter, Caleb said quietly. You're worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to that. I don't want you to die for me. Margaret's hand slid down to rest over his heart. I want you to live with me, here, on this farm. Help me rebuild it into something strong and sustainable. Be my partner, not my protector. I'm not a farmer. You're a fighter, a strategist, someone who knows how to survive impossible odds and come out the other side. Margaret smiled slightly. That's exactly what farming is when you get down to it. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested on his chest. What are you asking me, Margaret? I'm asking you to stay. Not out of obligation, not because you're healing from a bullet wound. Stay because you want to, because this place, this life, me, we're worth staying for. What would people say? I stopped caring what people say the night they stood silent while I was humiliated at that auction. Margaret's voice was steady, sure. The only opinion that matters to me is yours and mine. So the question is, what do you want? Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw the war happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to run, to retreat to the safety of solitude, battling against the part that wanted to stay, to try, to risk his heart one more time. I want to wake up knowing I'm building something instead of just killing time until I die, he said finally. I want to look at you across the breakfast table and know that I get to do it again tomorrow. I want to stop running from the possibility of happiness because I'm afraid it'll be taken away. He pulled her closer. I want to stay, Margaret. If you'll have me. I'll have you. Margaret rose on her toes and kissed him, and it felt like coming home and starting an adventure all at once. Broken shoulder and questionable past and all. You know nothing about my past, Caleb said against her lips. Don't need to. I know who you are now. That's enough. They stood in the kitchen holding each other as the morning sun streamed through the windows, two people who'd survived the worst the world could throw at them and decided to try for something better. The door burst open and Dorothy Chen rushed in, her face flushed with excitement. Margaret, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to hear this. She stopped short, seeing them in each other's arms. Oh, I can come back. It's fine, Dorothy. Margaret stepped back but kept Caleb's hand in hers. What's happened? Judge Harrison came to town. He's finished the asset seizure of Shaw's properties, and the territorial government is redistributing everything. Dorothy's words tumbled over each other. All the falsified debts are being voided. All the stolen properties are being returned, and Margaret, there's money. Shaw had nearly $10,000 hidden in various accounts. The judge is splitting it among his victims as restitution. Margaret's knees went weak. $10,000? Your share is over $800, enough to not just save the farm, but to properly rebuild it. New equipment, new livestock, everything you need. Dorothy was practically bouncing with excitement. And it gets better. The Territorial Mining Office investigated Shaw's claims about gold on your property. There's color in that creek, enough to make it worth working. You could lease the mineral rights, get a steady income without even having to work the claims yourself. The news was almost too much to process. Margaret had spent 3 years fighting just to survive, scraping together pennies, making impossible choices about what to sacrifice to make it another month. And now, suddenly, she had resources. Real resources. The ability to not just survive, but thrive. "There's more," Dorothy continued. "The new town council, the one without Shaw's influence, they want to make amends. They're organizing a community workday to help repair your farm. Fix the barn, mend the fences, do all the heavy work you haven't been able to manage alone." She paused. "It's not enough to make up for what happened, but it's a start." Margaret looked at Caleb, saw her own shock reflected in his face. "When?" "This Saturday, sunrise to sunset. Bring food, bring tools, bring willingness to work." Dorothy smiled. "The whole town's coming, Margaret. Everyone who stood silent before wants a chance to stand with you now." After Dorothy left, Margaret sat down heavily in a kitchen chair. "This is really happening." "Seems like it." Caleb sat across from her, the familiar position they'd occupied so many times over the past weeks. "What are you going to do with $800? "I don't know." Margaret laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. "I've been so focused on just making it to spring, I never let myself think beyond that." She looked around the kitchen, saw the cracks in the plaster, the worn floorboards, the window that didn't quite close right. "There's so much that needs fixing." "So we fix it." Caleb's hand found hers across the table. "Together." That Saturday, Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of wagons coming up her lane. She looked out the window and saw them, dozens of people from Redwood Hollow, carrying tools and materials, coming to make good on Dorothy's promise. By the time the sun was fully up, the farm was swarming with activity. Men worked on the barn, replacing rotted boards and reinforcing the foundation. Women organized food and supplies, turning Margaret's small kitchen into a bustling hub. Children ran everywhere, helping where they could, their energy infectious. Michael Chen led a team replacing fence posts. James Pritchard and his brothers were on the roof of the house, patching holes and replacing shingles. Even Eleanor Shaw came, quietly working in the garden, preparing the soil for spring planting. Margaret moved through it all in a daze, accepting apologies and gratitude in equal measure, watching her worn-down farm transform before her eyes. Caleb worked alongside the men, his shoulders strong enough now to handle the labor, his quiet competence earning respect from people who'd feared him weeks ago. By sunset, the transformation was remarkable. The barn stood straight and solid, the fence was mended and reinforced, the house roof was weather-tight for the first time in years. The community had brought more than labor. They'd brought materials purchased with their own money, livestock to replace what Margaret had sold, seed for spring planting. As people began packing up to leave, Dorothy approached Margaret one last time. "This doesn't erase what happened at that auction." "No," Margaret agreed, "it doesn't. But maybe it's a start at building something better. A town where people stand with each other instead of watching each other fall." Margaret looked around at the farm, at the people who'd spent their Saturday making amends, at Caleb standing beside the newly repaired barn, watching her with those steady gray eyes. Maybe it is. The weeks that followed were filled with work, but it was different work than before. Margaret wasn't fighting to survive. She was building toward a future. With the restitution money, she bought proper equipment, good breeding stock, quality seed. With Caleb's help, she planned crop rotations and irrigation systems and all the improvements that had been impossible when she was alone and desperate. The mineral rights lease brought in steady income, enough to hire occasional help during harvest season. The farm began to thrive, and with it, Margaret herself seemed to bloom. The lines of stress around her eyes eased. She laughed more. She let herself plan more than a week ahead. Spring came in earnest, and with it, Sarah Kemp, Helen Vargas, and Jane Morrison, the other widows Shaw had victimized. They came seeking Margaret's advice, asking how she'd fought back, how she'd survived. Margaret welcomed them, shared what she knew, helped them navigate the restitution process and the challenges of rebuilding their lives. They formed an informal alliance, these women who'd been written off by the town, supporting each other in ways that went beyond money or labor. They shared knowledge, resources, and the understanding that came from surviving the same trauma. One evening in late May, Margaret and Caleb sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the sun set over fields that were finally planted and promising. The air was warm, carrying the scent of growing things. "I've been thinking," Caleb said quietly. "Dangerous habit." He smiled. "I want to make this official. Not just me staying, but us. Together. Properly." Margaret's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Caleb North, are you proposing to me?" "I'm asking if you'd consider being my wife. Not because of convention or what people expect, but because I want to build a life with you, a real one. The kind with plans and dreams and a future that goes beyond just making it to tomorrow." Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking about Thomas, about the 27 years they'd shared, about the promise she'd made at his grave to honor his memory by surviving. She'd kept that promise. She'd done more than survive. She'd fought and won and reclaimed her life, and now she had the chance to choose something new. Not to replace what she'd had, but to build something different alongside it. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you, but on one condition." "Name it." "We do it our way. No big ceremony, no town spectacle, just us and a few people we trust, building the life we want instead of the life people expect." Well, Caleb's smile was warm and real and completely his. "I can live with that." They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the farm, with Judge Harrison presiding and Dorothy, Michael, and a handful of others witnessing. Margaret wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself. Caleb wore his best clothes, which weren't fancy but were clean and well kept. They exchanged vows under the oak tree where Margaret had buried Thomas's favorite hunting dog years ago, promising partnership and honesty and the courage to keep choosing each other even when it was hard. That night, lying in bed in the house that was now truly theirs, Margaret felt Caleb's arms around her and realized she'd found something she'd thought was lost forever. The feeling of not being alone. Not just in the practical sense of having someone to share the work, but in the deeper sense of having someone who saw her, really saw her, and chose her anyway. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked in the darkness. "That auction," Margaret said, standing on that platform feeling like the whole world had decided I didn't matter anymore. Feeling like maybe they were right. They weren't right. I know that now, but in that moment, I believed them. She turned in his arms to face him. "And then you walked in and paid $5 and everything changed. I told you before, I didn't do it for gratitude. I know why you did it. You did it because you saw someone being treated cruelly and you couldn't stand by and let it happen." Margaret's hand found his in the darkness. "But here's what you didn't know. You didn't just buy a basket that night. You reminded me that I was worth fighting for, that my life, my work, my dignity, they all mattered, and that gave me the courage to actually fight." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I thought I was saving you, but you saved yourself, Margaret. I just gave you a reason to believe you could." "Then we saved each other," Margaret said, "because I think you needed to believe you could still make a difference in the world. And I needed to believe I was worth making a difference for." They fell asleep holding each other, two people who'd been broken by loss and hardship and cruelty, who'd found in each other the strength to become whole again. The years that followed were good ones. The farm prospered under their joint management, becoming known throughout the territory for quality produce and fair dealing. Margaret leased the mineral rights carefully, ensuring the mining operations didn't damage the land while providing steady income. She and Caleb became advocates for widows and others vulnerable to the kind of predatory practices Shaw had employed. When Judge Harrison asked them to testify before the territorial legislature about reforming property and debt laws, they agreed, helping shape legislation that protected people from similar exploitation. Sarah, Helen, and Jane rebuilt their own lives with Margaret's support and guidance. Sarah started a bakery in town. Helen turned her property into a boarding house for travelers. Jane partnered with Margaret to expand the farming operation, sharing equipment and labor in a way that benefited both families. Redwood Hollow itself changed slowly but steadily. The new town council operated with more transparency and less tolerance for corruption. The community that had stood silent during Margaret's humiliation became one that actively protected its vulnerable members. But not everyone was happy about the changes. There were those who'd benefited from Shaw's system, who'd profited from others' desperation. They grumbled about Margaret's influence, about how a woman had destroyed a man's business empire, about the unfairness of holding powerful men accountable for their actions. Margaret didn't care what they thought. She'd learned the hard way that some people's approval wasn't worth having, and that her own sense of right and wrong was a better compass than public opinion. 5 years after the auction, on a cold December evening, Margaret stood in the same town hall where she'd been humiliated, but this time the circumstances were drastically different. The community had gathered for the annual Christmas celebration, and Margaret had been asked to speak about the changes the town had undergone. She looked out at the crowd, saw Dorothy and Michael, Sarah and Helen and Jane, saw faces young and old, saw a community that had learned hard lessons about justice and mercy and standing up for what was right. 5 years ago, she began, her voice steady and clear, I stood on a platform in this room, holding a Christmas basket and feeling like my life was over. I was 53 years old, a widow, drowning in debt, and everyone in this room had already written me off. You decided I was too old, too weak, too alone to matter. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, remembering. But here's what you didn't understand. Strength doesn't fade with age. Dignity can't be auctioned off. And the ability to fight for what's right doesn't require youth or beauty or the approval of powerful men. It just requires courage and stubbornness and the willingness to stand up even when you're standing alone. She paused, let the words settle. I'm not telling you this story to shame you, though maybe some shame is warranted. I'm telling you this because there are others out there like I was, people who've been dismissed, written off, told they don't matter anymore. And I want them to know that the world is wrong. They matter. Their lives matter. Their dignity matters. And they have the right to fight for it, especially when everyone tells them to give up. Margaret looked at Caleb, standing in the back of the room, watching her with pride in his eyes. 5 years ago, one man walked into this hall and paid $5 for a basket worth 75 cents. Not because he wanted the basket, but because he couldn't stand watching someone be treated cruelly. That one act of respect, of recognition that I was worth something, changed everything. She turned back to the crowd. So here's my challenge to all of you. Be that person. Be the one who stands up when everyone else is sitting down. Be the one who sees value where others see burden. Be the one who refuses to let cruelty masquerade as convention. Because you never know, that one act of courage might be exactly what someone else needs to save their own life. The room was silent when she finished, and then Dorothy Chen started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the whole hall was applauding, not just for Margaret's words, but for the truth they represented, for the change they'd witnessed, for the town they were trying to become. Margaret stepped down from the platform and walked straight to Caleb, who pulled her into his arms and held her tight. You did good, he murmured into her hair. We did good, she corrected. All of us. Together. That night, walking home through the snow with Caleb's hand warm in hers, Margaret thought about how strange life was, how the worst moments could become the foundation for the best ones, how loss could teach you what really mattered, how being broken could show you how to be strong. She was 58 years old now, with silver in her hair and lines on her face that told stories of hard work and harder choices. The town no longer saw her as a burden to be managed, but as a force to be reckoned with. And she'd found love again, different from what she'd had with Thomas, but no less real, no less valuable. The farm was thriving, the community was stronger, the widows Shaw had victimized had reclaimed their lives. And somewhere in the territorial capital, laws were being written that would protect others from similar predation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still hard days, still challenges, still people who resented the changes or wished things had stayed the way they were. But it was real, and it was earned, and it was hers. As they reached the farm, Margaret paused to look at the house lit from within, warm and welcoming in the winter darkness. The barn stood solid and straight. The fields lay dormant but ready for spring, everything they'd built together, everything they'd fought for. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked. Margaret smiled, squeezed his hand. I'm thinking about that auction, about standing on that platform feeling worthless, and I'm thinking about how wrong I was. You were never worthless. I know that now, but more than that, I know that my value doesn't depend on whether other people recognize it. It exists whether they see it or not. And the only person who needs to believe in it is me. They walked into the house together, closing the door on the cold winter night, on the past with all its pain, on the version of Margaret who thought her life was over at 53. Because it wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, she was writing the story herself.